Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Learning Continuum Series. What goes up must come down, and home prices defy gravity. So I'd like to pass things over to Learning Carter, Director for McMaster Continuing Education.
Thanks very much, Jennifer, for getting us organized this evening. My name is Learning Carter, and I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you to this event. Before we would proceed with the event itself, we would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which McMaster University sits. McMaster recognizes and acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce the speaker in just a moment, but I'd also like to recognize Cynthia Bolesky, the Managing Director, who is here and representing what is the Faculty of Social Sciences Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative. And it's really great to see you, Cynthia. Cynthia does a lot of work in housing on behalf of the Faculty of Social Sciences. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Steve Pomeroy, Industry Professor, McMaster University, and Executive Advisor to the Canadian Housing Evidence Collaborative, called CHEC. Steve is an Ottawa-based research consultant and part-time lecturer at Carleton University and McMaster. Widely regarded as one of the leading housing policy experts and thought leaders in Canada, Steve has, for almost 40 years, worked in the housing sector, initially in the not-for-profit sector, local government, and with HMCH, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, before establishing Focus Consulting, Inc. in 1994. Since then, Steve has completed over 200 research reports covering all aspects of housing, including needs analysis, comprehensive housing strategies, and financial feasibility, as well as urban issues, both in Canada and internationally. He advises regularly a number of national and provincial housing associations, many municipalities and provinces, and is an advisor to the newly created Federal Housing Advocate. He is also a frequent commentator on housing issues in various national and local media. But, and this is important, he doesn't tweet. There are any number of reports that you might want to peruse to learn about Steve's insights and his research. I could read them, but we might be here for a while, Steve. So I'm going to pass things forward to you into this evening's talk.
Thanks, Lorraine. I'll just jump through the share screen piece here. Make sure this all works. Hopefully folks can see that. So thanks for all coming. So I guess the title of this talk is somewhat provocative, just in terms of it's a very topical issue at the moment. Of house prices have been going up quite dramatically over the last few years, and people, I guess, wonder, many homeowners and wannabe homeowners more particularly, I wonder if they'll ever come back down to earth, and if young folks, our kids and millennials and others, will be able to afford them. So I will sort of, the intent of the talk is not so much to talk about that, will prices come down, although I will speak to that, but it's more about this broader issue that's really sort of entered much of the discussion in the media, bank economists, politicians, for a number of months, indeed over a year, have been focusing on the issue of housing affordability, and have centered on the issue, defining the problem as the fact we have insufficient supply. And as a consequence, the prescriptions to address that particular problem are that if we just have more supply, we'll start to manage the excessive increase in home prices and everything will be just fine. As you can imagine from this particular slide, I actually have a contrarian view on that. I think that the view that simply adding new supply will solve the housing affordability crisis. It's a very specific and clear definition It's a very simple definition, and I think it's completely wrong. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining why I think that, and to provide some evidence to support my thoughts on that. A lot of this discussion has really originated since sort of the spring of 2020 with a report that was put out by Scotiabank Economics, comparing Canada to the rest of the G7 and noting that we have fewer homes per capita than the rest of the G7, ergo we must have a shortage. I think that's a particularly simplistic and actually irrelevant comparison, because the other part of the comparison, which was not talked about, was that we actually have, in Canada, we have the largest average household size in the G7, except for the US, which we're very close to. So we actually put more people in each house, therefore we don't need as many houses. So that's not a very useful way to actually think about defining the problem. In recent data that we've seen, both from the census that came out in February of this year, where we could see actual population growth over the last 5 years since 2016, we can compare that with data from CMHC, and we can actually identify the fact that the number of homes that we actually built in that 5-year period significantly exceeded the growth in the population, depending on how that population splits itself into houses, the average household size. So I think that's the first piece of evidence that suggests there's something to question about this notion that we have undersupply. So let's look at the rest of the data and see what it actually tells us before we come up with a conclusion, and so I'll come back to the end. I mean, essentially my point is that if you don't not diagnose the problem correctly, and it's like going to the doctor and getting prescribed with a headache and they cut off your foot, we need to actually diagnose it correctly if we're going to start to think about what are the right policy prescriptions to respond to the problem. In terms of what causes home prices to go up, there are really two sets of factors: the quantity of demand versus supply. So how many people are there? How is that population growing relative to the number of homes we're building? But more importantly, and spoken about much less, is the quality of that demand, the capacity of people to actually exercise their desire to purchase a home or to rent, and what's actually been happening in that sector, which I think is much more significant and much more important in terms of explaining the reason for the very significant increase in escalation of home price that we've seen in the last couple of years. So starting on the sort of the demand side, the population is the fundamental. What we really see in this chart is looking at data both for Canada and Ontario. Pretty well since the turn of the millennium, we were bouncing along nationally at about 350,000 people a year, 110, 120,000 in Ontario. And then things really went askew in 2016-17, and we saw a significant surge in population growth, which then, of course, rapidly stopped when COVID came, when the pandemic started, and we closed our borders. Because most of the growth in the population is not from natural growth, it's actually from immigration. And people are coming from other countries, and we really have to be concerned and or cognizant of what kind of immigration targets we have, who's actually coming, and how we actually house them going forward. So there was a short-term effect for a couple of years where we did have a real surge in population, and the reality is people can get on a plane today and arrive tomorrow. We can't put a house on the construction grid and have it finished by tomorrow. It takes 2 or 3 years to go through a planning process and approvals process to build it and actually have it occupied. So there's, as economists would define it, there's a very low elasticity of supply. Supply simply cannot respond either to price change or to demand change very, very quickly. And there certainly is some debate around how sluggish the supply system is, and whether certain municipalities are very bad at making approvals. And I think they're probably unfairly tarnished with that reputation. But nonetheless, that's one of the things that came up, for example, from the Ontario Task Force, that we just need to basically get municipalities to approve more buildings more quickly, and everything will be just fine, which I think is a bit of an overstatement. So as I've said, the nature of that population growth, we were bouncing along fairly steadily, and what we see here are 3 types of growth. Natural growth, which you can see is really tailing off as particularly the baby boom ages. And obviously the end point of the aging is mortality. So we're having quite a lot more deaths than we're having births. So our natural growth is actually quite small, which is actually good for the housing market, because when a senior kicking around in a 3 or 4 bedroom house passes on, they leave a 3 or 4 bedroom house for a young family. Whereas a birth doesn't actually create demand, but that young family now can move into a house. So there's no net need for a supply chain if in fact we can actually exchange the stock within the existing stock. So in many respects, grandma can solve the housing crisis for us without the government if we just free up some of those large houses and get them occupied by families. But the key point here is that what we saw in that 2016-19 period, at the nature of immigration then, the red is net international migration, the green is what's called non-permanent residence. And that's the part that really grew. And non-permanent residents include people working on temporary work permits. So we got a lot of population, a lot of folks coming to work in either the resource sector or in the agricultural sector, picking crops and those types of things. In most cases, folks in those two industries tend to be housed temporarily in bunkhouse kind of accommodations, so they're not really creating rental demand. The bigger part of that group, however, are international students. And this is really a reaction of post-secondary educations to declines in government funding for post-secondary education and the needing to find new sources of revenues. The easiest source of new revenues is from attracting foreign students who pay significantly higher tuition fees. So we had a whole number of educational institutions really proactively pursuing and recruiting international students. And that really drove up that population growth in that period. But of course, the students, this really has more of an impact on the rental market than it would have on the home ownership part of the market, although ultimately some of them may choose to become Canadian citizens or permanent residents and actually stay here. And this is just sort of breaking this down at sort of the metropolitan level, the two biggest growth areas in the country, or Montreal as well. But Toronto particularly is particularly impacted by international migration. And we see the same things here, the rise of temporary non-permanent residents, the red part of the bars there. More importantly, though, is the yellow part of these charts, which is net intra-provincial. So folks leaving, in this case, the Toronto CMA or the Vancouver CMA and moving somewhere else in the province. So yes, we've got a lot of international immigrants moving in. We've got a lot of people also moving out of the city. Some of them may be the international folks that stayed for a while and moved on. Some of them may be folks who've lived there for a while. They're cashing out, they're retiring, they're moving to smaller communities. This data is really pre-COVID, so it's not really picking up the COVID migration piece, although it is a little bit in 2020. It's more the stuff that was going on naturally. Whether that's a reaction to excessively high home prices and folks can't afford to live in Toronto, it would be another explanation. But certainly the impact of immigration is much, much larger on the GTA than it is, for example, in Vancouver. Vancouver gets about 10% of international migrants. Toronto gets a third. So a lot of the issues we're hearing about of undersupply reflect the fact that we haven't actually stopped building houses or building any fewer houses. It's that we're getting more people. They're very, very heavily concentrated in coming to Toronto. And because the media is very Toronto centric, the media thinks this is a national problem, and it's really a GTA problem for the most part. Notwithstanding that it is happening in other places, but not to the same degree. So how have we responded to that demand in terms of housing starts? Again, we fluctuated up and down over the years in different cycles, booming economies, the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. We saw a bit of a dip in housing starts that year, a small recession, then got back on the treadmill again and started gradually going back up again. And we really have responded very, very strongly in the last year, in 2021. This is Ontario rather than national data. But we were averaging 69,000 homes a year for the decade 2010 to 2020. 2021, we increased that by 40%, up to 92,000. Nationally, we went from about 200,000 to 270,000 units. So a very, very strong response across the system, which suggests municipalities are doing quite a good job of approving permits and builders are upping their game and figuring out how to get homes built. Now, of course, starts, you can't occupy a start. You have to wait till that house is actually completed and you can move in. So again, there is a lagged effect here, and we may see some benefit of the starts in 2021. In the case of singles, about a year. In the case of multiples, 2 or 3 years before they become complete and available to be occupied. But the point here is we are already seeing a response to the market, and the market signals seem to be working quite well. if we look about, we put these two things together with population growth and starts. So this is a chart where I'm charting the number of dwelling starts per 1,000 growth in population. So unlike Scotiabank that looked at per capita, all the people in the country, I only looked at the change in the population and how many new people we are having each year since the more or less the turn in the millennium. And this is data both for Canada in gray and for Ontario in orange. Canada was doing better than Ontario for the first 5 or 6 years, and then they pretty well went along the same until 2016. And we see a massive dip in both cases. Obviously, what we saw in the earlier chart there of a significant increase in migration. It wasn't that we were slowing down and building fewer houses over this period. It was that we had more people. Therefore, the ratio of starts per 1,000 population went down. But even looking at those dips and looking at the average across the period, Ontario has been basically averaging about 463,000 homes. The rest of Canada done slightly better, about 100 more, 75 more, 534 starts per year. And if we look at that in sort of terms of how many people per house that represents, the average household size in Canada is about 2.45 persons per house. It's been declining slightly from about 2.5 down to just around about 2.4 in 2021. But across this period, we've been actually had only 2.2 people in Ontario, and even less, 1.9 in the rest of Canada. So we're actually creating sufficient amounts of housing to accommodate the population growth that we've seen over the last 20 years. This chart actually tries to smooth the variations in those year-to-year starts by using a 3-year moving average. But we can basically see that we've done pretty well in terms of keeping up with growth in population. So where do these folks come up with this notion that we have an insufficient supply problem? It's bewildering when you actually look at the data. So that's the supply side of the issue, and I'd like to now turn over to the demand side, and the key factors on demand and their impact on home prices. We've already talked about the quantity of population growth and how that translates into households and that translates into demand, but it's then what are the incomes of those households? What's their borrowing capacity? And increasingly important in the recent years is their accumulated equity that they're also bringing to the table in terms of their ability to purchase. And I would argue that's probably the most significant factor in driving up home prices over the last few years. What we've really seen is that a pretty steady and gradual increase in incomes over the last 20 years, essentially going from roughly 70,000 to 104,000. This would be family income, so couple of families, no parent families, it excludes singles. So to some extent is higher than the overall median income for households, but the folks buying homes tend to be 2 income earners. So it's more representative of the actual folks we're talking about here. At the same time, we've all heard lots about the declining interest rates and how that has had a very significant effect on improving ability to borrow money. And again, probably the key driver in terms of home price increases over the last little while. When we put these things together, it's the combination of the income that you have and the interest rates that are prevailing. So if we just look at a simplistic price to income ratio, we can see a very, very significant divergence over this time, and people get quite alarmed over the fact that home prices have gone up much, much faster than incomes. Ergo, housing is less affordable. And to some extent that's true, but actually ignores the fact that it's not so much the comparison of income to price, it's the comparison of what that income can do for you in combination with mortgage rates, which actually translates into your ability to actually borrow against your income. Keeping the same price to income chart and adding another chart on the right, what I've done here is basically taken the prevailing median income in each year, the prevailing interest rate, and calculated how much mortgage the median household family could afford to actually borrow in each of those years. And what we actually see here is the capacity to pay has exceeded the median house price every year. This is national aggregate data, so obviously there are variations in specific housing markets, but as an overview and general trend, until last year, the ability to pay exceeded the home prices. Now, that doesn't mean these are median households. So yes, for the median, they did fine. There are a lot of folks who have less than median income and couldn't get into the market. But we'll come back to this in a moment in terms of the proportion of folks who are actually making the market, the folks who are actually active in the market and actually causing these changes in price, which we see right here. So we basically have, roughly 16 million households in Canada, just over 10 million owners, and almost 5 million are renters. The number of folks who are active in the housing market buying homes each year is less than about 5% of all households. So it's a very, very small number of people. So it doesn't take very many people to drive up those prices. That, folks with median and above incomes are the ones that are most active in the market and quite capable of paying, as we saw in the previous chart. And they're also significantly resourced. They've got double incomes, and I'll come back to in a minute. They've got this increasing amounts of home equity. So, nationally, each year we're selling about 550,000, 600,000 existing homes, and then another 150,000 of the new starts that we're building are designated for home ownership. The others are rental. So the combination, that's about 700,000 homes in total out of 16 million. So it's only about the 700,000 that we're actually concerned about, and more particularly the existing homes where folks are much more active. And there's a real issue in the media and the way these issues are described in terms of lack of supply relating to home prices. What most media articles are talking about is not the lack of new construction. They're talking about an insufficient number of existing houses listed for sale by existing owners. So there's the big difference between the inventory of homes available for sale than there is from actual construction. And we tend to conflate both those issues. And during COVID, of course, a lot of folks didn't want to put the house on the market. They didn't want folks traipsing through the house due to transmission of the pandemic and so on. And so we saw a low level of listings at the same time that we saw a lot of folks decided they actually wanted to move to something where they had more space because they were working from home. So you have these dual factors kind of going on there. But it wasn't so much the lack of new construction, which we saw in the previous slide actually increased quite dramatically. It was the lack of listings that was tending to impact on house prices a lot more. Now, the other piece that I just alluded to, it's not just, so we've got this, the low interest rates combined with income are creating this incredible capacity to pay, which is above the median house price, and therefore it's pulling up house prices because people can bid above what the average house price is, or the median house price is. But the other thing that's happened is that as we sleep in our beds at night, we get richer and richer. Our houses actually have a higher income earnings than we do. And just by sleeping in your bed, you're getting richer as you sleep. What this chart is showing us, the blue line is the aggregate value of home equity that's grown over the last, since 2011, so the last 10 years, and particularly a significant increase in the last 2 years, compared to the orange line, which is the Bank of Canada total amount of residential mortgage debt in the country. So mortgage debt in the last 2 years increased by $302 billion. So we were taking on a lot more debt, and people get all worried and excited, negatively excited about the fact of the impact this is going to have on the financial system, or these high levels of household debt. But they're not looking at the asset on the balance sheet of the household and how much equity they actually have. And the amount of equity actually increased by $2.4 trillion. There's a typo on my slide. That should be, well, sorry, no, it's not. It's 2,374 billion, which is 2.4 trillion, if we do our math right. So 8 times as much is the amount of equity. Now, the other part of this is that most of the folks buying homes, 3/4 of new home buyers or people purchasing a home, not necessarily a new home, are existing purchases moving up, trading down, doing something else, and they're bringing this equity with them. And that creates a massive amount of, they've got these bags of money as they go down to the realtor's office, say, I want to make a bid on this house. Not only have a good income, interest rates are really helping me buy, but I got all this windfall gain of money that I've accumulated over the last few years by sleeping in my bed at night. And this is something that I've tended to, or that's actually Greg Sutter from Toronto, in an earlier paper that I wrote, made sort of a comment on this term supercharged demand. And I think that's what it really is this, as house prices increase, appreciation begets more appreciation. And these folks are using that accumulated equity to actually translate into their capacity to buy. And so they have lots of capacity to overbid on home prices. So effectively, it's not the greedy developers that are driving up home prices. The consumers are doing it to themselves. We've had this steady decline in mortgage rates. We've had this supercharged demand coming from all this excess equity. As I mentioned, the vast majority of purchasers already own a home, and so they're benefiting from that existing equity. Not all, but many first-time buyers are also being helped by their parents, who can now pay, those who are selling their $3 million home to downgrade to a $2 million home can basically give $500,000 each to a couple of their kids to help them with a down payment, a very substantial down payment. I'm obviously exaggerating, but with the idea. So there's a big impact there of those small number. Out of that 700,000, only a couple of 100,000 of those are millennials, young families. A significant number of those are getting helped from their parents and grandparents in some cases to purchase. So it doesn't take very many people to really perpetuate and continue this cycle of upward pressure on prices because of this excess capacity to pay. And it's really the windfall gains that are actually creating this particular capacity. And that's really not being talked about very much in government circles. It's very much this insufficient supply argument. No one's talking about this excess capacity to buy, because government's scared of the answer. Because if there's excess capacity to buy, if you want to solve the problem, it's not politically attractive, because it means confiscating some of that windfall gain, which means a tax on homes. 2/3 of voters are homeowners, so it's a political non-starter. The minister's drawn a line in the sand and basically says that the government will never change the capital gains exemption for principal residents. I would argue that you don't have to change the capital gains treatment. You could simply create a tax, an affordable housing levy, or call it what you want, and basically cream off some of that excess capacity to pay and use the revenues you generate to actually subsidize or cross-subsidize some of the programs you've just announced in the budget, the $10 billion, rather than actually affecting the deficit. So basically the answer to this will new supply result in reduced home prices. I would argue it really will have a very minimal effect. We've already seen a significant increase in construction, but new construction is really only 20% of the market. It's the existing home sales that are the important part. The other part of this, though, is that we all know areas of our city that are attractive, and the so-called yellow belts and the single-family areas that many politicians and the Ontario Task Force recently has spoken about, that we should basically just upzone these areas to 2, 3, 4 units as of right, not require any kind of rezoning kind of process. And that's part of this solution of increased supply. But people want to live in those areas, and as we've just seen, they have lots of capacity to pay. And if you basically go into, whether it's the west side of Vancouver or Rosedale or Glebe in Ottawa, whichever city you happen to live in, those inner city areas where we're talking about doubling and tripling the density, is tripling the density going to mean that the builder on that lot is now going to sell the house at 1/3 of the price of the existing home? Or is he going to basically build 3 homes equal to the same price or higher than the existing one? Certainly in my neighborhood, builders are buying existing single family lots with 1960s, 1970s bungalows on them, quite a modest little home, good starter home for a family, paying $600,000 or $700,000, knocking it down, building a semi-detached home and renting selling each side for $1.4 million. We just doubled the density, we doubled supply, we also doubled the price. So this notion that somehow just adding supply will magically result in reductions or stalling and slowing in the rate of increase of home prices is a complete myth, and it's just absolutely unfounded. And if we are going to add supply, then we need to be very surgical and prescriptive about what kind of supply we really want to add. We want to add supply that's filling parts of the missing middle that many folks have spoken about. So rather than small condos or large custom detached homes, we need more townhomes and smaller dwellings. And we also need it to be affordable, which we can certainly see has not been the case. The question there is, can government policy, can this new $4 billion housing accelerator fund do anything to actually manage or control or prescribe price? This is an example from Ottawa, and we've seen, more so than we've seen in the rest of the country, perhaps, a very, very significant supply response in the last year, with the housing starts increasing by 58%. So if the argument that if we have more supply, we'll address the excessively rising prices in homes, on the right-hand side, we see what's happened to house prices. I mean, builders are not going to say, I bought this lot, 2 years ago and started building. And back then I could have sold it for 500. It's worth 700 now, but I'm still going to sell it for 500. I haven't met too many builders that think that way. So basically builders are capitalizing on the windfall gain of these rising prices and saying, great, I just made a lot more profit than I ever thought I would. Now, certainly they have to take that and go and buy land at today's inflated values, and it knocks on in the marketplace. But again, what this is showing us is that the dramatic increase in supply, particularly in Ottawa's case, a lot more condos, but some singles as well, has really not translated into any kind of cessation or slowing down of the rate of increase. If anything, home prices actually increased faster as this was happening. Now, if we flood the market, as the government proposes to do by building 350,000 homes a year, will that have some effect? Possibly, but I don't think we'll ever get anywhere close to 350,000, and we certainly don't need 350,000. If we look at the budget, it announced that the government plans to bring in 451,000 new immigrants each year. And on top of that, we have natural population growth, which now is down to about 50, 60,000 a year, so call it 75. We're up to 525,000 people. In our average household size of 2.4, we need about 220,000 new homes per year. That's basically just about 10% more than what we've building. It's not double what we've been building. And we increased that. We significantly exceeded that last year with 277,000. So we've actually got to the point where we're actually constructing enough homes for the new level of growth that we project will happen. Now, that's not going to be distributed evenly, in some communities and some cities are going to be more affected by others. But it does suggest we need to think twice about just cavalierly accepting this notion that we're going to double home construction. And we need to basically invest a whole bunch of money in getting municipalities to approve permits faster. Because the other part of that is it's not just making approvals. It's how much labor do we have? How much materials do we have? Where else in the supply chain are we going to impact? And actually, the effect of doubling housing construction in a year or two would be to massively inflate and increase house prices because of the other supply chain issues that can't keep up with that new level of demand or new level of supply. So again, I think we have to really think about how we're going to implement that. Today, now these high home prices that we've seen, they're very much baked into the market. There are very few folks are opportunistically putting the home on the market. If they can't sell it for what they see at this great new price, they are very reluctant, unless they have to move for other reasons, to actually go ahead with the sale. We've got a bunch of the folks who, the fear of missing out on buying now because they think prices are going to continue to go up, are continuing to overbid, particularly those that have existing equity, and because many of them do, and they're enabled by these bags of money that I've been talking about, and some of their kids are benefiting from that as well. So if we want to really impact on housing affordability, we need to actually not just think about supply. We need to think about how do we address this excessive quality of demand, and to some extent we've got a bit of a correction going on there on the interest rate side, not so much on the bags of money side. So we go back to the fundamentals that I talked about in the first slide. On the supply side, how many folks have we got coming in? What's our projections on immigration and population growth, which I just spoke about. And yes, we do see an increase, and absolutely, I would agree with the notion that if we don't keep up with our supply with population growth, prices will go up. What I'm saying is the inverse is not necessarily true. If we actually add supply, the price will necessarily go down. So yes, we need to increase supply, but I think we pretty well got there in the last year. We just have to sustain the new levels that we achieved in 2021. And if we can build 230,000, 240,000 homes a year, which we've proven ourselves to be capable of doing, I think we'll just be fine in terms of the supply side. So basically that's a positive. I put these in green and red. So in terms of what's going to happen to prices and rents, the green things are things that are going to continue to push prices and rents up. The red things are things that would stall that growth. So on the demand side, incomes are going up, and certainly with inflation, and we'll start to see this translate into new wage demands and increases in wages. So the steady increase we've seen in wages over the last 20 years, that's likely to tilt up a bit more. So now we've got more capacity to pay as a result of increased incomes. But the combination of that capacity to pay with interest rates is the one thing that's going in the other direction. We've already seen the Bank of Canada raise the bank rate by 75 basis points in its last 2 moves. We expect that it'll move at least 200 basis points, maybe even 250 over the next 18 months to 2 years, which means variable rate mortgages are going to be hitting 3.5% to 4%. 5-year money is going to be pushing 5.5% to 6%. That will bite, and it will have a big impact in the market, and that's the one hope we have. So the government actually has to do nothing. All it has to do is let Tiff Macklin do his job, manage inflation, raise interest rates, which will therefore raise mortgage rates, and that will actually have probably a bigger impact than any spending program the federal government can come up with to address the rising home prices. And the most important part of that, 2 things really. One is a lot of the purchases we've seen, those folks with the bags of money, a fifth of them, 20%, are investors. And they're buying second properties on the basis of the fact that they see this as a great way to park their money and see it grow at 20% a year, because they're looking over their shoulder to see what it grew the last year. So that's a significant factor of investors. As soon as interest rates go up, many of those investors purchased because they were trying to make sure they had enough cash flow to cover their costs, were purchasing with variable mortgages. As they basically see the variable mortgage rate go up much more quickly. When folks with a 5-year mortgage, if they had one 2 years ago, it won't renew for 3 years. Folks with variable rates are going to be affected right away, and about 30% of the market are variable rate mortgages. So, and particularly investors. So they will actually have a bit of a hit. Some of them may be inspired or forced to sell the property. They'll cash out the gains they've already got and say thank you very much, which will bring more properties onto the resale market and increase the inventory of listings. And along with that, first-time buyers who are trying to get into the market, yes, rising interest rates are going to make it harder for them. But if they can sort of sit and use the new savings accounts that the government's come up with for a couple of 3 years, and if we can stall price growth while they can actually accumulate their down payment, and ideally, if government could come up with a special initiative, a low interest rate initiative for first-time buyers to help them get into the market, that would probably be a good thing as well. So negative impact on home prices are rising interest rates. The supercharged demand that we see there is very much embedded in self-reinforcing. And there are so many households that are now sitting on massive amounts of wealth that the next 5% of purchases, 4% of whom are existing owners, will continue to be there. So I don't see that one really going away. And if government really wants to address this issue, as I mentioned before, the only way they can really do it without just leaving it to Tiff Macklin and the Bank of Canada is to confiscate part of that windfall gain and provide, collect some kind of tax on sales. And this, government seems to think this is sacrosanct, mainly because of a report that came out from Paul Kershaw and the Generation Squeeze folks that suggested some kind of a tax like this. It blew up in the financial media. The Conservatives accused the government of attacking people's capital gains. And so in a political reaction, the minister said, we will never tax capital gains. So it was a political play. It's good politics, but it's bad policy. But it's something that the government doesn't seem very interested in doing, but it's probably what they should do if they want to really address this problem. I don't think they have the political will to implement an affordability levy, but provinces have put in place land transfer taxes. 1.5% of sale is collected in transfer taxes. We could have a federal land transfer tax or property transfer tax and collect some money to cover off the various initiatives we're trying to do to address affordability. And it wouldn't be a big impact. For someone that just gained 50% on the price of their house, to give up 1% and 2%, they paid the realtor 4 or 5% to sell their house. It's not a massive impact. It's not attacking capital gains, and it could quite easily be implemented if they had the will to do it, which it seems they don't. So we'll see where that one goes. So I guess my overall sense is I don't see prices coming down. I see them continuing to go up, except for if we do see the bite of interest rates that could stall that particular growth process. So I'm going to quickly flip over to the other side of the housing market. I really talked about home prices, but rents are even more important because this is where affordability is most acute. Renters on average have half the incomes of owners. They have less capacity to pay. They don't have any choice. Those who choose to own can own. Some folks do choose to rent. It's a lifestyle choice, but many rent because they can't afford to own and they can't get into the ownership market. And we did see a period of time in the mid-1990s to 2006 where we saw a dramatic increase in the home ownership rate in Canada, which went from just under 63% to almost 69% in 10 years. That's 800,000 renters that became homeowners. 80,000 renters a year on average moved from being renters to being owners. And the consequence of that was, even as I'll come back to later, the fact that we were building very little new rental housing didn't matter because we created 80,000 vacancies because people were able to access the home ownership part of the system. We flash forward to 2015, 2016, for the first time ever in the census, we saw the homeownership rate in this country actually go down from almost 69 to 67.8. And people were constrained by getting into the market, young families, millennials and so on, both by high prices, but also by a whole onslaught of macro-prudential policies, stress tests, new borrowing rules, new mortgage insurance rules. I think there were 21 different policy changes that all constrained access to debt for the purposes of purchasing a home. And the effect of that was to stall this movement of renters into home ownership. If you stall the movement into home ownership, you leave demand in the rental market, you put pressure on vacancy rates, you put pressure on rents. Rents are going up and the poor people live in the rental market and they're the ones that get hurt. And that's why I said before that government should basically, if they could put a tax on a levy on home sales, they could actually use that money to fund a program specifically for first-time buyers to help them get into the market with low interest rates without having massive inflationary effects on the market because it's only a small part of the market. And by doing so, they would have a very beneficial effect on the rental market. So I'll just go through a couple of quick slides here on some of these other points, but the rental construction has been very low. Given that home ownership rate I just gave you, 2/3 of us own, 1/3 of us rent. So if 1/3 of us rent, ideally 1/3 of housing starts should be rentals. Well, through the 20 years from 1995 to 2015, less than 10% of new starts were for rental housing. This is a chart for Ontario, and it's even worse in Ontario. But it has edged up over the last few years, now up to 15% in Ontario. The national data, we were up last year to 32% of total starts were for the rental market. So we actually have seen a significant increase and the expansion of new rental supply. It doesn't have very much to do with the federal government's rental construction financing initiative. That really is only attributable to about 5% of this rental starts. Most of it is a market response to demand and developers seeing the opportunity to put new rentals on the market and collect very good rents, which I'll speak to in just a second. So we actually, this low level of rental construction, as I mentioned, was completely offset by the fact that in this period, we saw all of these folks leaving the rental sector and moving into the homeownership sector, which actually saved our bacon. We're now actually, in this period, we're no longer getting out of that. So low rental construction has been a serious issue and what we need to address. It's not just low supply though that affects vacancy rates. It's this migration that I talked about at the very beginning. And there's obviously, this is almost like a mirror image of when immigration goes down, vacancy rates go up. When immigration goes up, vacancy rates goes down. So if we got lucky here, ironically, in silver lining, I suppose, of COVID, that we actually reduced immigration, and so the vacancy rates went down quite significantly, in this period, but they started coming back up again already in here. What's going to happen when this line actually starts to go out over here? And we bring in 450,000 new immigrants a year. Clearly, we are going to create demand. Immigrants tend to be renters before they purchase in many cases. So this is going to be a big impact on the rental market and one we need to think about. And when vacancy rates go down, rents go up. Again, we see sort of a correlation, when the time when vacancy rates are going down, we see much faster year-to-year increases. This is the year-to-year increase in rent. So in 2000, rents in Ontario went up by almost 7%. In 2019, it went up by 6%. In a province which has a rent regulation guideline that says the rents can only go up by 2.1% in 2019. So how did rents manage to go up by 6%? Because 20% or 19% of the units turned over and we have vacancy decontrol, and the units in those units that turned over went up by 21%. So the overall average was 6, but for folks who were actually leaving their existing home and trying to find a new rental, they were facing a very, very significant increase in the rent level. So this is a real serious issue for low-income renters, obviously, who can barely afford the rent, or in many cases can't afford the rent they already have. And if for some reason they have to move or are evicted because they didn't pay their rent, finding somewhere else is very, very difficult. So trying to address, any supply is not necessary. Affordable rental supply is really critical to address this particular issue, because what we've seen in the last 5 years is the significant increases in the rent levels, but also new construction. This is basically a custom data set from CMHC that looks at the average rent, the blue, of rental units that were built before 2016, and the orange is the average rent in the units built after 2016, and the gray line is the ratio. So basically in London and Ottawa, new rental construction is coming on the market at 65% above the average market level. In the lower increased cities, Kingston, Oshawa, it's about 130%. So, yes, we're building new rental supply. We've upped our game nationally. We've gone from 20,000 units a year to almost 80,000 last year, but at the cost of very high rents, which are not affordable. And in many cases, we're actually knocking down older rental buildings to build these new buildings. So we actually lost some existing affordable stock along the way, which obviously had a negative impact, which is this point here, that not only we're not building enough rental, we're actually demolishing and or losing a lot of the existing affordable stock. This is the change in the number of units between 2011 and 2016. We don't have the 2021 data yet. But nationally, we lost 320,000 units renting below $750 a month. That's affordable to an income up to $30,000. At the same time, under the national housing programs, we were building about 20,000. We built about 40,000 units in that period. So we basically, for every new unit we built under the federal provincial affordable housing program, we were losing 15 in the existing stock. Some of these were demolished, which we see here by comparing the change in the CMHC monitored purpose-built stock. The vast majority of them, they still exist, but they've gone to much higher rents because of issues that are referred to as financialization of large capital funds going and buying moderate rate properties and upgrading them and basically raising the rents using various strategies of just natural turnover, some cases accelerated turnover through renovictions. But we're massively losing the existing affordable stock, which is really creating significant problems. You can't exit the homeless shelter unless you can find a cheap place to rent. And if we're losing all the units under $750, which even by itself is more expensive than someone in the shelter can afford, but obviously this is having a negative impact on the housing system as a whole. So just to wrap up quickly, as I've already said, if we don't diagnose the problem correctly, we're not going to get the right solution. We didn't diagnose it correctly, and we have a solution, a $4 billion solution that's being promulgated by the federal government called the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is going to give all kinds of incentives and bribes to municipalities to ostensibly up their game, which they've really already done. The city of Victoria just adopted a policy last week to accelerate the approvals for affordable housing. So in the absence of any bribe from the federal government, they did it anyway. So I think we've seen municipalities already doing these kind of things. I don't think we need to spend $4 billion. We do need, supply is part of the problem. I'm not saying that it's not an issue, but it's not the issue. And I think it's a combination of the two things together that we need to really think about. We certainly do need supply if we're going to accommodate the high levels of immigration that we've identified. So it's a necessary but insufficient answer to excessive home prices. I think where we need to act is much more strongly, rigorously on the demand side. As I say, inadvertently, the Bank of Canada is doing that for the government and maybe doing them a favor. The government, I think, is very, very reluctant to do the right policy thing in terms of bringing in a levy on home prices and sort of creaming off some of those windfall gains that people really didn't earn in the first place. And in the absence of doing those types of things, I don't think there is much hope that we will actually slow down the trajectory of, we might slow it down, we will see a natural slowing down of the trajectory. I don't think we'll see another 30% increase year to year going forward, but I don't think we'll see it stalling completely. And I don't think we'll even see it coming down to the rate of inflation unless interest rates do significantly bump up and take a bite out of potential capacity to pay, and hence out of demand, particularly on the investor side. So that's my perspective on will prices come down? I would say probably not.
First and foremost, Steve, thank you so much. You've offered perspective here that I suspect some in the crowd, certainly myself, would not have had without your time and expertise here. So, and you've started from the position that let's diagnose the problem correctly, which I think is pretty fundamental. So thank you for that. And as a final point, I would like to share that McMaster Continuing Education has a new program in Canadian housing, and Steve is part of that. The next course, if a person is at all interested, begins early May. I think it's May the 2nd and runs through to July 25th, and that's a special topics course. But you can certainly see the level of information and experience and expertise that you might discover in those courses. So thanks a million for coming out, everyone, and I hope the rest of the evening is yours to enjoy.